All right, everybody. All right. Go ahead, grab your seat. Salt Company, great to be with you guys. All right, open your Bibles to Genesis 37. Salt Company, great to be with you all tonight. Fall retreat weekend, it's going to be incredible. I don't think I'm on a team, but I'll be there, and I'll be cheering on gold. Yeah. Yes, let's go. I just had to side with Josh. Like, whatever team Josh is on, let's go. But no, fall retreat is an incredible weekend. So this will actually be 12 years of fall retreats for me, and they're some of my favorite weekends of all time. So I cannot wait to see what God does this weekend, to spend time with one another. It's going to be awesome. This weekend, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph. So Joseph is a character in the Old Testament. His story begins in Genesis 37. So if you haven't turned there yet, go ahead and open to Genesis 37. And it's an incredible story. Joseph is one of the main characters of our Bible, of the Old Testament. And we're going to spend the weekend getting to know who this man was and what his story was. So I know quite a few of you can't make it, so I have two pieces of good news for you. The first good news is we're going to record every session, so you can dig through those afterwards, look through them, that'll be great. The second piece of good news is I actually brought this with me tonight. The story of Joseph. So if you can't make it, I'm going to give you the entire story right now from this kid's book. I stole it from Isla's bedroom right before I left tonight. It's a great little kid's book. So I'm going to read this for us so that you know what you can expect this weekend from the story of Joseph. So here's the story of Joseph. I'll try to hold up. Every Tuesday I read in Jack's kindergarten class, so I'm pretty good at showing pictures off. So I'll get it. So the story of Joseph. Joseph's father loved him so much, he gave him so you got the picture, Joseph's father, beautiful haircut. I don't even know what that haircut's called. It's like a mop? Bob? It could be a mop. You could tell me it's a mop, I'd believe you. A bob. So Joseph, if you didn't know, was a white guy with a bob. Okay. Not like a Palestinian, Middle Eastern guy. So you got Joseph's father loved him so much, he gave him look at this, there's a flap. Coat of many colors. There we go. Joseph's brothers were jealous of him because they thought their father favored him. There's Joseph. There's his brother. Also mops. Mops. No, bobs, right? Man, I am stuck on mops. Joseph with his mop. Okay, Bob. Joseph could interpret dreams. The Pharaoh told Joseph about a dream he had. Sorry, that side. There you go. I got you, Nick. There you go. With 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, which meant a terrible famine would come. 7 fat cows, 7 skinny cows, bad famine coming. Joseph became very powerful and was in charge of, there he is, very powerful, in charge of, selling food during the famine. The end. The story of Joseph. All right. Okay. Let me pray, and then the worship team will come back up. No. All right. I didn't just read that book because I wanted everybody to get a synopsis of the story, though I hope you now have a synopsis. No, here's why I read that book. I think with Bible characters, so often we have this children's board book view of Bible characters, right? We read this book and on the one hand, it was true, but this book was kind of like Red Riding Hood without the wolf, right? It's like Red Riding Hood without the wolf is a girl who bakes cookies for her grandma. The end. True, that is what happened, but incomplete. And so often what we have with Bible characters is this children's board book view of them. And when that happens, kind of one of two things could take place. On the one hand, we can think the Bible is just stories of these nice little people in neat little towns, but their lives aren't relevant to us at all. That's like one thing that could happen when we think the Bible is full of stories like this. On the other hand, though, we could think like, man, the Bible is full of these heroes who had these perfect lives, and God must really only use people who have perfect lives, and God must only be for people who have perfect lives. Well, this is not what we're going to see in the story of Joseph this week. Like I said, this book is true, but this is incomplete. Joseph's story is actually a story of significant brokenness. It's an incredible story, but it's a painful story. Inside Joseph's story that we're going to see this weekend is intense pain, intense dysfunction inside a family, a story of brokenness, and yet it's also a story of restoration. And so this weekend, maybe like you've heard the story of Joseph before, maybe you haven't, but what I think is true is many of us maybe have only thought about this story through this lens. And what we're going to do is see how the Bible doesn't hide the flaws and brokenness in the lives of the people that it tells the stories of. And inside of it, what we're going to realize is that God's grace is displayed in our brokenness. That he actually used heroes that had significant brokenness in their lives so that we would know that he's a God for broken people. That the stories in the Bible actually are relevant to our lives. That it's not just perfect people with nice little stories that are used by God, but it's people who are real and who have real problems and real brokenness that we can relate to. So what we're going to see throughout Joseph's story is 4 kind of areas of brokenness that we experience in life and that Joseph and his family experienced. 4 areas of brokenness throughout the week. And the first area of brokenness we see right as the story begins in Genesis 37, and we're introduced to a very broken family. So look at Genesis 37 with me. Here's how it begins. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel, pause, Jacob had 2 names, Israel and Jacob, same guy. So verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. So here we're introduced to Jacob's family, and we meet teenager Joseph. He's 17 years old as the story starts. He has 10 older brothers. He's the youngest brother in this family. Jacob's family, they were nomadic, meaning they lived in tents, moved around. They tended flocks. And we're introduced right here to 17-year-old Joseph. So teenager Joseph, the story starts, he's tending sheep. His brothers do something. He brings a bad report to his father. And right away, we begin to see clues that this family is broken. Notice, who does it say Joseph brought a bad report, or who he was tending sheep with? It doesn't say in verse 2 that he's tending sheep with his brothers. It says that he was tending sheep with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. What do we learn right away? These are stepbrothers. That there's more to this story than we would have maybe expected at first. So to understand how fractured this family is, we kind of have to go back a few pages in our Bible. So in Genesis 12, God shows up in the midst of all the brokenness of the world. Sin has happened, the fall has happened. In Genesis 12, God is going to kind of embark on this plan to redeem humanity. And to do that, he chooses one family out of the entire world, one family that he's going to choose to bring his Messiah through. And that family is the family of Abraham. So in Genesis 12, God shows up to Abraham and Sarah, says, I'm going to choose your family to bless the nations. I'm going to bring the Messiah, my son, through your family. And at that point, we would kind of expect like, man, who is this incredible family? But immediately we begin to see this is not the family we would have expected. So Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau attempts to murder Jacob because Jacob steals Esau's birthright. That's kind of like his inheritance. Jacob runs and flees from him, finds his uncle Laban, works for Laban for 20 years, eventually falls in love with Laban's daughter, Rachel. and agrees like, hey, I'll work for you. And then Laban's like, yeah, sure, you can marry Rachel. So they have the wedding. Jacob gets drunk at the wedding. Laban swaps Rachel at the wedding for his older daughter, Leah. Jacob sleeps with Leah, in the morning wakes up and is like, whoa, this is not Rachel. Like, that's in the Bible. Like, crazy. Like, drunk Jacob sleeps with Leah. And the reason that happens is because we're told that Leah had weak eyes. So Laban, we don't really know what weak eyes means, but honestly, it probably means she either had a disability or that she was just ugly. Like, that's probably what that means. So what was going on in their culture? Yeah, let's go, Gibby. You think that's funny? Yeah, Leah was ugly. Man, Gibby can't control it. Just calling you out, Gibby. I love you, man. Okay. I don't think we have enough relational bandwidth. I met him last week for me to call him out like that from stage. My bad, bro. Hey, I love you. Hockey forever. Are we good now? Okay, sweet. All right. So what was going on in their culture is that it was not typical for the younger sister to marry before the older sister. And so Laban most likely was having a hard time finding a husband for his older daughter. Deceives Jacob, swaps his daughters. Jacob is freaking out. Then Jacob goes back and is like, what in the world? And Laban's like, hey, work for me for another 7 years and you can marry Rachel. So he agrees, he marries Rachel, works for him for another 7 years. Those marriages began immediately in brokenness. Like here you've got Leah and Rachel. And Leah is the older, less attractive sister and unloved by Jacob. And then you have Jacob who's in love with Rachel, the more attractive younger sister. This family starts in dysfunction. And so eventually Rachel is barren, can't have kids, all the while Leah is having son after son after son for Jacob. She has 4 sons for Jacob. Rachel gets jealous. So she finds Jacob, says, hey, sleep with Bilhah, my slave. So Jacob foolishly sleeps with Bilhah, has a baby with Bilhah, Rachel's slave. Leah sees this. She goes, hey, Jacob, sleep with my slave, Zilpah. So Jacob is like in the middle of this dysfunction and this sister rivalry. Eventually, between these slave women and these sisters, they have 10 boys. And then finally, Rachel conceives and has Joseph. The woman that Jacob ultimately loved finally has a son for him. And it is no secret that Joseph is Jacob's favorite son. That's the dynamic of this family right now. For 17 years, you've got a dysfunctional family that started in brokenness and is still in brokenness. So here we are after 17 years, this messed up, broken family, and Jacob is out in the field with his stepbrothers and he tattletales on them. Jacob, he hears this report from his favorite son, probably chews out his older brothers, and then turns right around, and what does he do? He gives them a coat of many colors, just this beautiful gift. He favors them. And there's no indication that Joseph is upset. No, he seems like he's receiving it, that he likes this. So just for a moment, put yourself in the shoes of Joseph's other brothers. Their dad doesn't pay attention to them, is always saying things like, why can't you be like Joseph? As one of his sons that your dad doesn't ultimately love your mom. He's not even ashamed of it. Imagine the pain that you would feel as a son. You live with your dad, but you've been emotionally abandoned by him. This is the experience of Jacob's 10 other sons. And unfortunately, some of you don't have to imagine very hard to picture what that's like, right? That's some of your stories. Maybe not exactly like this, but that you have a dad who maybe you live in the same house with. He's physically present with you, but emotionally, he's abandoned you. Some of you know what it's like to be an older sister who your dad just wished you were more like your younger, prettier sister. Some of you know what it's like to be the stepbrother and to watch the favoritism of the biological son. Somehow your dad always takes their sides. You see the difference in birthday presents. You know the pain of being unloved by your father. You know the pain of being abandoned by him. I've been in college ministry long enough to know that there are some really hard stories of family brokenness in this room. Unseen stories. That maybe you look like a normal college student, but back home, things are really rough. A couple of years ago, back at Salt Company U&I, it was like a Thursday night, kind of right around this same time, and there was a guy that had been coming for years. And to my awareness, he's just a normal college guy, liked sports, did well in school, had been a part of our ministry, was a part of connection groups, went to fall retreats, was just a normal college guy. And this Thursday night, he was hanging around late, and we got into this conversation. I said, "Hey, what are you doing over Thanksgiving?" He's like, "Oh, I'm going back to Des Moines, where I'm from. I'm gonna see my mom." I'm like, "Oh, well, will you see your dad?" And he's like, "No, probably not." I'm like, "Okay, why not?" And he's like, "I haven't seen my dad for a long time." I'm like, "Well, where does your dad live?" He's like, "He lives in Des Moines." I was like, "Okay, why did your parents get divorced?" And I'm paraphrasing. I was a lot nicer. I didn't just dive straight in. But I was like, why did your parents get divorced? And he told me something unimaginable. He said, "Listen, I haven't seen my dad for 12 years because 12 years ago, me and my younger brother, when we were 8 years old, witnessed him attempt to murder my mom. The police came, arrested him, and I haven't seen him since." My jaw just completely dropped. In my mind, normal college guy, normal story, and behind this mask of normal was pain and brokenness and intense dysfunction. An unimaginable story. Look, I know that there are some really hard stories in this room. And maybe your story isn't that intense, but you know what it's like to be emotionally abandoned by a father. Maybe you haven't had the intensity of Joseph's story or that student's story, but you've experienced your father failing you. Long hours at work, business trip after business trip, maybe divorce or adultery, addictions, shallow conversations, missed sporting events. With stories like Joseph and stories like that student's and the stories that we carry into the room, what do we do with those stories? What do we do with the brokenness of our fathers? Here's one of the problems that sometimes brokenness with our fathers can cause. One of my closest friends in college confided in me after a couple years of going to Salt. He said, "Hey man, can I just be honest with you? It is really hard for me to sing songs about God being our father." I was like, "Why?" I love those songs. I was like, "Why?" And he's like, "Because my father has failed me so many times, it is hard for me not to project my father onto God." I think for some of you, your biggest barrier to God isn't questions about the resurrection or whether or not we can trust the Bible. Your biggest barrier to God is that you're projecting your earthly father onto him. And in your mind, you're thinking, "Man, how can I trust the promises of God when the promises of my father have never lived up? How can I trust that God won't abandon me when all I feel is abandonment from my father?" What do we do with the brokenness of our fathers? This sounds obvious, but let me just say, God is not your father. God is not your earthly father. Don't project your dad's failures on God. God's heart breaks for the brokenness that you've experienced. He didn't design families to be broken. And God, your true father, loves you, knows you, sees you. You are significant in his eyes. And I don't know why he let your father fail you, but I know that he's the kind of father who sacrificed his own son so that you could become his true son or daughter. I know that Jesus knows what it's like to experience the abandonment of a father, and he did that so that God could adopt us as sons and daughters, to offer us healing for our brokenness, so that God could become your perfect father. What do you do with the brokenness of a dad? You look to the true God, who is your perfect father, who will never abandon you, whose promises never fail, who loves you, sees you, and knows you. The story goes on, and as you can imagine, the brokenness in this family, it maybe started with Jacob, but it doesn't end there. There's brokenness within the siblings. Look at verse 5. Then Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us? His brothers asked him. Are you really going to rule us? So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Look, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, 11 stars were bowing down to me. He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is that you had? He said. Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So Joseph has these dreams, and it's hard to know like what his heart was behind it, but I honestly think it was like a heart to like nag and like upset his brothers. So like, for example, this probably happened a year ago or so, but we had at that time an infant, and what you do with infants is you swaddle them. And bad dad move on my part, I swaddled Jace, our infant, with Isla's like favorite blankie. This is her favorite blankie. She's at school, I swaddle Jace with the blankie. Jace has a blowout, which if you're not a parent, that means they poop everywhere so much that it blows out, like literally blows out. So Jace blows out, destroys Isla's blankie. Not really, like we cleaned it, but like it is just a mess. So Jack, my 5-year-old, sees this and he waits for Isla to come home from school. Isla literally opens the door and Jack goes, hey Isla, Jace pooped on your blankie today. Just like first thing that she hears when she walks in, precious Isla bursts into tears. Just like immediate like crying. Just like, what happened? Jack, I look at Jack and I'm like, dude, why did you say that? He's like, what? It's true. I'm like, yeah, it is true, you 4-year-old. Like, but you just said that to tick Isla off. And he's like, maybe. And I'm like, you did, Okay, we don't know if that's exactly what Joseph is doing. I think that is what he's doing. I think he knows that these dreams are going to upset and nag his brothers. So he comes to them. He's like, hey, I got a dream. You're going to bow down to me. Hey, I had another dream. Even mom and dad are going to bow down to me. And you got this arrogant 17-year-old teenage Joseph ticking off his brothers. So what happens? Look at verse 12. We're going to read from verse 12 to verse 36. So it's a pretty big chunk here, but this is the rest of the story. So verse 12, his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, your brothers, are pasturing the flocks at Shechem. Get ready. I'm sending you to them. I'm ready, Joseph replied. Then Israel said to him, go and see how your brothers and the flocks are doing, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the Hebron Valley, and he went to Shechem. A man found him there, wandering in the field, and asked him, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my brothers, Joseph said. Can you tell me where they're pasturing their flocks? They've moved on from here, the man said. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, oh, look, here comes that dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, let's not take his life. Reuben also said to him, don't shed blood. Throw him into the pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the long sleeve robe that he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, without water. They sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin, going down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When the Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" So they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the robe in its blood. They sent the long-sleeved robe to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?" His father recognized it. "It is my son's robe," he said. "A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned his son for many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will go down to Sheol to my son mourning." And his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards. Okay. For a moment, come to grips with just how horrible this story is. Right? This story is not this. This is a horrible story. His brothers plot his murder. The oldest son, Reuben, says, "Hey, don't kill him, just throw him into a pit." So they do that, and while Reuben's gone, they decide, "Hey, let's make some money off this, and let's just sell him into slavery." So they do. They cover his robe in blood. They send it to their dad. And if you're familiar with this story, it's just crazy. I grew up familiar with this story, and how many times I just nonchalantly was like, "Oh yeah, Joseph's brother sold him into slavery." Just nonchalantly said that or thought that. It's this is horrible. This is a horrific story. It's wicked. Try to picture how 17-year-old Joseph would have been reacting throughout this story. He wasn't just "Great idea, guys. Bob Joseph, let me just jump into this pit." That's not what happened. Imagine what a 17-year-old youngest teenage son would be thinking as his brothers grab him, throw him into a pit. He has no idea what their plans are, why they're throwing him into a pit. Imagine how he's reacting. His brothers would have been hearing him, pleading for mercy. From the pit, "Brothers, what are you doing? Why? I'm sorry, let me out. Guys, come on." And think about how cold-hearted you have to be to sit down and eat a meal next to the pit that your youngest brother is in. You're just sitting there eating a meal as you're hearing your youngest brother say, "Guys, have mercy on me." And then to be so cold-hearted that you see some Midianite traders coming and you're like, "Hey, let's make some money off of this. Why just kill him?" How much hatred has to be in your heart to pull your brother out? And you can almost imagine the false hope that Joseph would be having. "Oh, guys, thank you so much." And then he comes out of the pit and there's these Ishmaelite, Midianite traders. And they're "Yeah, that one, 20 pieces of silver." And you just sold your youngest brother into a lifetime of slavery. Who knows where to who knows who, doing who knows what. This is a horrific sin. There are some terrible things that humans can do to other humans. And we could argue what is the worst thing that you could do to another human. But this has to be up there. A group of brothers planning murder and then deciding to throw their younger brother in a pit and then selling him to a lifetime of slavery. This is a horrific story. And then to convince your dad to pour blood over his robe, to convince your dad he's dead. A vicious animal ate him. This is a vicious, calloused, and wicked sin. This is a broken family. Brokenness from their dad, brokenness with their uncle, brokenness with their mothers, brokenness within the brothers. This is a broken family. Example of brokenness after brokenness. And it leads us back to the question that we kind of started with in Genesis 12. This is the family that God chose. This is the family that God chose to bring Jesus through. A family that is murderous, deceptive, backstabbing, rivalries, hatred, favoritism. This is the family. How could this be God's chosen family? Right? And then not only that, like eventually as you keep going in the Old Testament, these brothers who just sold Joseph into slavery, well, they're the guys that each tribe of Israel are named after. The 12 tribes of Israel, like eventually Rachel has a second son, so now 12. Like these are the guys, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Like a lot of us have heard of the name Judah. It was his idea to sell Joseph into slavery. How is this the family? How are these the brothers that God would have picked to bring Jesus through? Right? You would never expect this family. Why did Jesus come through this family? Here's why. Jesus chose this family so that his grace could be displayed through brokenness. It's so that you and I would know that God's family are for people that come from broken families. That Jesus isn't scared of your family brokenness. Like you realize this isn't just Joseph's family that's broken. This lineage would continue. This is Jesus's family. Jesus's family is a broken family. Why does that matter to us? It matters because there is no brokenness that God can't handle. There is no brokenness that his grace is not powerful enough to heal. There is no brokenness that you could experience that God would say, yep, that's too much. You can't be a part of my family. He can handle your brokenness. This family proves that God can offer grace to the most broken families imaginable. But how? How can God restore this family? How can he redeem this family? Well, the only way God could redeem this family is if the eternal, perfect family was broken for us. You see, one way to think about God, if you think about the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, is that they are a family, that they have existed for all eternity, perfectly delighting in one another. And you realize that the only way that God can offer us grace and healing is if God the Father would send God the Son and abandon him on a cross. The perfect eternal family had to experience brokenness so that you could have healing, so that you could experience a father who never would abandon you, so that you could have a brother who would sacrifice his life for you. That's the way that Jesus can offer us healing from our brokenness. Jesus died on the cross so that we could have an eternal family, so that we could have a perfect father, so that we could be called brothers and sisters with Christ. To have a father who only keeps his promises and a brother who sacrificed his life for ours. What Jesus did gives you a perfect father and a perfect brother. And here's the reality. It's only when we realize this that we'll actually have the resources to navigate the brokenness in our families. Right? When you know that you have an eternal Father in God who will never abandon you, who knows you and loves you, that gives you hope to navigate and endure in the midst of challenges with your Father. When you know that you have a brother like Jesus who sacrificed his life for you on the cross, that gives you the resources to offer forgiveness and patience to your siblings. In Christ, there is healing and forgiveness for the brokenness we have walked through with our families. Jesus' family is a family with brokenness. And yet, over the course of this weekend, we're going to see that it's a family that was restored by his grace. A family who was redeemed by him. This weekend, we're going to see Jesus displays his grace in our brokenness. His grace has the power to heal your family. But not only that, his grace also offers you hope. His grace offers you hope. The hope that you can actually be the turning point in your family. To be completely honest, I have an awesome family. I'm so grateful to have a family that, we have our problems, but nothing like Joseph's problems. And I'm super grateful for that. But the Jones family wasn't always like that. And the reason why I'm blessed today to have a healthy family is because 4 generations ago of Joneses, there was somebody in my family that was the turning point. My great-grandfather, his name was Gordon Jones. He was the turning point for the Jones family. So 1 generation before Gordon was my great-great-grandfather. He was a vile dude. So he was in the Civil War, was in a prisoner of war camp. We have like letters that he wrote to my great-great-grandmother, and he survives the Civil War only to come home and gets drunk in a bar in the middle of winter, falls off his horse, catches pneumonia, and dies 2 weeks later. Like he was a drunkard and just a vile guy. My great-grandpa Gordon was 2 years old when that happened. Just like a little bit later, then his mom died. And so my great-grandpa, having a dad who was an alcoholic, a mom who died prematurely, he was raised by his sister for like the rest of his childhood. Eventually, he gets married to this girl named Lois. Let's go, Lois. Gordon and Lois get married. They have 3 kids. My papa was one of them. They're from the South. We call him Papa, Delmas Jones. Delmas Carlton Jones. That's his middle name. So now they're just this like middle-aged family, 3 kids. Gordon is 40, doesn't know Jesus. And they lived on Marable Hill Road. Well, this man named Brother Sam knocked on my grandpa's door or great-grandpa's door one day. And Brother Sam said, hey, we just moved to town. We're planting a church. We're going to start this new church and wanted to talk to you about Jesus. And over the next 8 weeks, Gordon and Lois met with Brother Sam and a small group of people in their neighborhood. And after 8 weeks of meeting with him, Gordon gave his life to Christ. My grandpa was 13 years old when that happened. A family that before that was godless and for generations didn't know Jesus, didn't follow the Lord. Gordon was the turning point for our family. Eventually, they started a church in that neighborhood called Marable Hill Chapel. Brother Sam officiated my grandparents' wedding at Marable Hill, officiated my grandma's funeral at Marable Hill. I've been there a bunch of times. And it's just this incredible story of how God used Gordon to be the turning point for our family. And now for 5 generations, Joneses have followed the Lord. 74 years ago, Brother Sam knocked on my great-grandfather's door, and our family was forever changed. You know what this story and Jesus' grace is offering you? It's not just offering you healing, but an opportunity. An opportunity to be the turning point for your family. That maybe your family has been marked by brokenness for generation after generation, and yet you have the opportunity through the grace and power of Jesus to be the turning point. To say, I'm going to follow the Lord and change the trajectory of my family for generations. That maybe 74 years from now, there would be 4 or 5 generations of people from your lineage that would say, hey, my great-grandfather or my great-grandma, they went to Minnesota State. They got involved with this college ministry. They started reading their Bible, and they realized who Jesus was, and everything about our family changed because of what happened to my grandma or my great-grandpa at college. You have the opportunity, regardless of the brokenness that you walk into this room with, regardless of what has defined your family up to now, you have the opportunity to be the turning point. Jesus' grace and power can do that. And what if 74 years from now, there'd be a bunch of grandkids that would say, what happened at Minnesota State in 2024 changed our family for generations? Joseph's story shows us that's possible because Jesus uses broken families and the weak things of this world to accomplish great things. Jesus' grace and power can handle your brokenness, and it's in our brokenness his grace is displayed. Let's pray. Jesus, that is exactly our prayer. That this would be the year, that this would be the semester, that the stories of families would change. That what you're going to do in people's lives in this room isn't just about the individual story of them finding Jesus. It is about that, but it's about so much more than that. That God, we don't want students just to have a great 4-month experience this fall in Salt Company. We want you to change the next 4 years of their life. And then we want you to change the next 4 decades of their family. And we believe that your grace has the power to do that in their families, regardless of what they brought into this room, the brokenness that they've carried. Jesus, you redeemed our brokenness on the cross because you were abandoned by your Father so that we could have a Father who would always fulfill his promises to us. Jesus, you were abandoned on the cross so that we could become co-heirs with you, brothers with you, sisters with you, and have a brother who wouldn't throw us into a pit, but who would go into the pit of death for us. So that we'd have a brother who wouldn't sell us for pieces of silver, but he himself would be sold for pieces of silver to redeem us and save us and heal us through his grace. God, this weekend, would it be a life-changing weekend for each of us as we look at the story of Joseph? And not only would it be life-changing for us, but would it impact our families for generations? Amen.